Morality as a concept has always been interesting to me, not in terms of do's and do-nots, but in the reasons why people come to the conclusions that they do regarding morality. The things that people consider right and wrong and how they come to those conclusions can tell you a lot about a person. A lot of moral discussions today revolve around political issues, so much so that it's hard to distinguish where the moral considerations of a person ends and when the political implementation of that idea begins. This causes a lot of frustration in modern politics because what is really going on underneath is a clash of moral visions. And even this clash of visions really isn't all that well defined on either side. People are so used to thinking in terms of politics that disagreements of political implementations are taken as a sign of evil intent, even more so when trying to move these discussions to the proper moral level. This tendency to see morality as a set of do's and don'ts seep into video games in a variety of forms. We have already discussed in previous videos these failings like the disconnect between narrative and the choices one makes. Other failures like how the moral evaluation of a choice is imposed without consideration that others may see the choice differently depending upon their moral view. What makes this interesting to me is that no matter how unstated or denied, no matter the philosophy advocated or buried, the views expressed or submerged in narrative, every game, every narrative, every action has a moral basis for its views. Sometimes these views are explicit, sometimes they're hinted at, other times not mentioned at all and expressed through actions. To me, this illustrates, I believe it's C.S. Lewis' first portion of one of his arguments for morality. That is, everyone from the moralist to the die-hard moral relativist does in fact believe in moral standards. The minute you say, that's wrong, you are in fact forming a moral judgment. And that's okay, because you simply can't go through life or organize your actions in any meaningful way or have anything like a common good without a moral stance of some kind. For those who state that morality is relative, the only real way one can live that view consistently is if one takes no moral claim on anything ever. Likewise, the story of any media has at least some framework of morality bolted onto it in order for it to have coherence. It gives the characters of the story agency and provides the context of the events and actions that take place, and without it the narrative devolves into little more than empty events. What makes game morality frustrating though is that more often than not, games with more narrative-driven gameplay attempt to appeal to a common denominator of moral principles that have no relation to the context in which they take place. Most of the time there's little explanation for why things are good or bad and simply import a moral framework. This is even more important when political implementations of such morals are brought in wholesale. Easily recognizable real-world political issues are worked quote-unquote into the narrative in a way so obvious as to be distracting. And often enough those views betray the prejudices of a particular side. This isn't to say that every work must lay out the conceptual moral framework each and every time. In fact, the morality of the media must be relatable in some fashion to the audience in order to make sense. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the point of stories. The breakdown happens when games attempt to work more moral complex questions into their narratives. When narratives try to get more sophisticated than floor moral concepts, the development of those narratives still suffer from an assumed shared moral framework, assumptions that become less justified as the complexity of the narrative increases. It becomes readily apparent that while the attempt to tackle more complex moral questions is a desire in a lot of narrative games, the thought put into those moral perspectives is quite lacking. So much so that good characters are more or less simply framed as good from the story's perspective, and the evil characters are framed in the same manner. This is reflected in two ways. The first is how good characters' values, judgments, and moral principles reflect in very blunt ways the values of modernist secular types. The principles of autonomy, sexual, social, and everything in between, are readily apparent. And for the most part such values aren't even questioned, let alone the consequences of such radical autonomy even considered. The second and more obvious way is how evil characters are portrayed in games. Very rare is the villain in the game something other than an evil psychopath or mindless zombie. And even when the villain is not either of these two, the motivations and worldview are rarely thought out well enough to be considered understandable. This is especially true with the clumsy way political topics like racism are brought into games. Not only do such topics present a very Americanized version of these issues, but also very narrow-minded perspectives. And in particular, those who exhibit the bad ideas are often portrayed as imbecilic and infantile. The reductionism creates caricatures of people in situations that do little more than reflect the prejudices of the authors. This is especially grating when it comes to the portrayal of religious people in games. When they are the villain, they are the power-hungry, moralizing hypocrites. When they are good, they are at best uneducated simpletons whose heart is in the right place. Although in that respect, game media and other forms are in the same boat. What is left then is that morality in such media is just simply a case of do's and don'ts. There is little rationality in why the moral framework is the way it is. It isn't rooted in anything other than the whims of the creators of such media. Morality in these games is little more than arbitrary rules dictated by the creators with little to no justification. This is what I refer to as disembodied morality. The moral precepts that the game communicates are little more than arbitrary rules imposed on the world. It gives the world an event structure and context, but does so in a disconnected and imposed fashion. There is little information about what orders such principles, and even less why one would follow them save for a shared notion that good is worth pursuing. Contrast this with the Catholic view of morality, for example. Morality in the Catholic view is not the arbitrary will of the Creator, but fundamental to the natural design of the human person. A person is at their best potential when being moral because a human being's design is to be like God, and the way one is like God is when he is doing good. Now obviously I don't expect everyone to run out and embrace a Catholic ethos, but the point is that disembodied morality hinders morality in games because it is arbitrary. It is the morality of the author slammed into the media with no attempt to ground that morality in a world that is created. This is especially true given that a lot of these games remove some form of God who might at least lend authority to such arbitrary rules. One of the goals of media is often to demonstrate a moral viewpoint. Stories have been one of the first ways to communicate moral truths, and they do this by way of storytelling, creating a scenario to illustrate the point. Disembodied morality is the opposite of this. Instead of the story grounding morality in a concrete fashion, the moral viewpoint is imposed on the world in an arbitrary fashion. It warps the world rather than being revealed by it. Now, one might wonder what the solution to this is. Well, unfortunately, this is a rather complicated and deep-seated problem in modern Western culture as a whole. See, disembodied morality is a result of a disconnect between the moral position and any substantial reasoning upholding that position. In Western culture, the autonomy of the individual reigns supreme. The symptoms of this manifest differently depending upon which side of the political aisle you fall on, but it is there nonetheless. So much does the individual reign that the moral precepts that one lives by originate in the self. This is shown in many ways, such as our outrage culture. The very notion that people might disagree with a moral principle at a foundational level is enough to excommunicate them from your circle. One only needs to point to the toxic political culture as but one example of this. To further the problem, modern Westerners tend to eschew moral viewpoints that don't originate from within their already tight window of acceptable ideas. I don't need a Bronze Age book to tell me what is right and wrong is but one example of a tendency to avoid or demean any moral framework that doesn't line up with modern sensibilities. This causes the moral perspective to be rooted entirely in the mind of the individual. Since all moral principles come from that individual's observation and experiences, the only place where that moral viewpoint makes sense is in that person's mind. Thus it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to shape a world where that morality makes sense to other people and is rooted in thought that can be communicated. The only real way to start to fix this issue is to expose oneself to moral viewpoints that do not originate with yourself. It's even more important to see that opinion from the perspective of the other in their own words and actions. The moral viewpoint is best supported when confronted and works with a viewpoint that not only conflicts with your view, but is the best possible presentation of that viewpoint. Sadly, because there are so many viewpoints and little reasoning beyond surface rationalization to support those points, it can be very difficult to expand one's mental landscape. This is a problem that goes to the heart of how modern society views morality, and as a result this problem won't be overcome quickly. But admitting there's a problem and defining the problem properly are the first steps to resolving it. My solution to the problem is to present the Catholic Church's view of morality when applicable. In my experience, the Church has one of the most well thought out systems of moral thought to exist, and the consistency of that thought and insight eventually convinced me to embrace it wholeheartedly. But for those who do not hold the Church in such regard, I think it would be a benefit to study the Church's moral vision in our own words. 2,000 years of refinement by some of the greatest minds the human race has produced results in a coherent and consistent system of moral thought that has withstood the test of time. Seeing how she arrived at her conclusions and how all those so-called rules actually have a purpose to them can help even those who don't believe see a thought-out moral philosophy in action. But defending those particular principles further is beyond the scope of this video. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.